Raluca and Marco, it's always good to catch up with my friends at the EU Tax Centre. I trust you're keeping well.
We are, Rodney. Hope everything is well with you too.
Very good, thanks. Very good. So, Raluca, we have talked on and off about just how much is going on in the EU. And I want to turn to perhaps the intersection between the EU and BEPS. What's happening in the EU today and in other European countries in terms of Pillar 2 implementation?
That's a really good question, Rodney, and it's actually top of mind for us in Europe at the moment. You'll probably remember that December was a flurry of activity in the Pillar 2 space in Europe. So there was this open question: will they not reach unanimous agreement? So towards the end of December, member states were able to adopt the EU directive implementing Pillar 2 into EU law, so the EU Minimum Tax Directive. And now member states have until the end of 2023 to implement the rules into domestic legislation. And the timeline that most member states have to apply is income inclusion rule from 2024 and under-taxed profits rule from 2025. There's also an option for member states to apply a domestic minimum top-up tax, so that will be something for them to decide on this year. That is the general timeline. There are some options available for some of the smaller member states, but generally they need to rush with their implementation of Pillar 2 in Europe. What is very interesting also is that we understand that the European Commission has set up a working group together with the OECD Secretariat, basically with the aim to help member states through this transposition process. I think they acknowledge the fact that, the timeline is very tight, the rules are complicated, the OECD is issuing administrative guidance on a continuous basis, so they're trying to support member states with their efforts to make sure that the rules are implemented in a coordinated way in the European Union. And I understand that meetings with the member states and the European Commission are starting this month, so February 2023. And I hope that will actually work to increase tax certainty for taxpayers as well, if member states are able to align their position and align their implementation timelines. There's some rumor that we might start to see draft legislation from a variety of member states this spring. The Netherlands is actually the only country that has already published draft legislation for consultation, and that public consultation ended in December 2022. But other member states haven't published anything yet, but they did indicate that they will probably open public consultations pretty soon. And outside of the European Union, obviously the UK is very important. They already published draft for consultation as well. So they're pretty advanced. Switzerland is another European jurisdiction that made clear their intention to adopt the IR and the UTPR, potentially a domestic minimum top-up tax as well. What is a bit unclear with Switzerland is whether they will apply the UTPR from 2024 as well. So that will be a timeline that's slightly different compared to the European Union. But I understand that a final decision hasn't been made on that yet. And anyway, legislation in Switzerland has to go through a public referendum, and that will happen this summer. And after the referendum, we will know more about what minimum tax will look like in Switzerland. And Liechtenstein followed with a similar announcement. They also referred to the EU and Switzerland with regard to implementation timeline. So a lot is happening, but more is expected to happen in the first half of 2023, and then we will see, how member states want to adopt the rules into domestic legislation.
Well, it's a very tight timeline that people are on now. So there's going to be a lot coming out very, very shortly. And I've got to believe, having us all just seen the administrative guidance that the OECD has released, a lot of people might be starting to get fatigued by the volume of change coming their way. Marco, perhaps I could ask you for your views. What are the key differences between the OECD's Globe Model Rules and the EU Minimum Tax Directive?
Sure. So I think in general, the idea of the European Union or the Commission was to have the directive as closely aligned as possible with the model rules. However, there are some some special things to consider in the EU due to EU primary law that requires that domestic situations and cross-border situations need to be treated the same way. And for that reason, the directive includes some broadened scope in terms of also including domestic groups instead of only cross-border groups. And also that the income inclusion rule is applied in domestic situations also. And as Raluca also mentioned, the directive provides two options for member states. First, that member states are allowed to apply a QDMTT, and then also that smaller member states can apply a deferral deferral to the IIR and UTPR, where they have 12 or less UPEs in that member states. And we understand that there are about 8 to 9 member states that would fall under this deferral option. And I think what's also important to mention is that the minimum tax directive makes reference to the ongoing work of the OECD, especially in relation to this safe harbors, and also some part of the guidance that was released in March is already included in the text of the directive. I think those are the key differences or key points to consider when comparing those two.
Well, Marco, I mean, that's really interesting. You did raise a point that's worth just pressing on again, this concept that in the EU, rules need to apply to both domestic operations as well as cross-border operations, and therefore whatever rules come out need to apply in the domestic context as well. I can imagine that that might cause some businesses additional complexity in their tax reporting framework going forward when these rules come out.
Yeah, probably. And also just for those groups that are only active in domestic scope, that they are also need to consider the globe rules now, if they are in the EU.
That's a really fascinating point that I'm sure a lot of people haven't really focused on just so far. And how will the EU member states deal with the OECD's ongoing work in relation to the global implementation framework?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, really hard to answer because it has different angles to look at. Maybe the easiest in some way are the safe harbors that the OECD is currently working on. Because the preamble of the directive makes direct reference to that work, saying that the commentary and also the implementation framework, including the safe harbors, need to be used, and I quote, as a source of illustration and interpretation. And there's also a placeholder in the directive, it's Article 32, that basically is a placeholder for upcoming safe harbors. However, the text of the directive is a bit hard to understand. It is pretty vague, saying that a safe harbor would apply if there's an effective level of taxation meeting the minimum rate, and also if that is based on an international agreement that all member states have agreed on. Now we have one issue, being that Cyprus is not part of the inclusive framework. So basically, not all member states have consented to that agreement on transitional safe harbors. So the question is currently whether Cyprus will also agree to that in order for Article 32 to kick in and require all member states basically to apply the transitional safe harbor rules. And also on safe harbor rules, it is important to note that Article 11 of the directive already includes kind of a QDMTT safe harbor, which is currently still subject to negotiation at the OECD level. but the directive already includes a provision saying that if a QDMTT is applied, no further top-up tax calculations are required. So that's it for the safe harbor. I think there are different angles also to consider. For example, in terms of reporting, we know that the OECD is currently working on a global information return, and the model rules also refer to that future work. The directive does not. So we need to see how member states or the directive will take into account potential amendments to the data points that are defined in the global information return, or potential simplifications that document from the OECD may provide. We understand that it's not the intention of the European Commission to make changes to the existing directive. So yeah, this is really a good question, how member states will deal with the reporting requirements. And another important aspect is the assessment of equivalence. So to see which IIRs, UTPRs, and QDMTTs actually reach the qualified status. We know that the OECD is considering to have a peer review process on that. Again, the directive does not really link to that intention, but rather provides for separate criteria in order for foreign IIR, it's only relating to IIR, to be considered qualified. And here we also need to monitor how this will evolve, if the Commission will basically stick to what the OECD peer review assesses, or whether the Commission will eventually conduct separate assessments on this.
That's quite a lot yet to unfold. So Raluca, political agreement was reached 2 months ago. In your view, what, if anything, should tax departments have achieved by now?
That's a really good question, Rodney. And whenever I think of this, I actually try to keep in mind the fact that although agreement was only reached at the end of December, the text of the directive was known for a while. So member states had reached a compromise before that, and the text that was adopted is one that was actually published in June, maybe last year. And that's actually part of the reason why we have all these issues that Marco highlighted, because the text was agreed upon well in advance of the OECD clarifying many of the important issues, including some that are still under consideration. So the reason why I mentioned that is because tax departments would have had the opportunity to consider, at least from an EU perspective, what the impact of the rules might be like. So I expect that many would have undertaken at least a high-level impact assessment to understand what roles different entities within their group play. So who is your ultimate parent entity? Are there any partially owned parent entities, so POPs? Which are the relevant intermediate parent entities? So all these relevant constituent entities, I expect, would have been identified before. They might have also looked at potential systems issues. I think this is an area that many tax departments struggle with. How are they going to get all the data that they need? What data do they already have, and which data points will they need to set up new systems to collect? So this sort of data gap analysis, that seems to be very important. And from our conversations with tax departments, we understand that they have tried to create cross-functional teams, bringing together not only tax experts, but also accounting experts, obviously, because these are complicated rules from an accounting perspective, but IT experts as well, just to help with this sort of data collection and data processing part. And this is obviously where tax departments work with outside counsel as well, just to clean up their data and to assess their systems. I think what's also important at this stage is to keep an eye on what's happening across the EU, to keep an eye on implementation timelines. Also to consider maybe a more detailed impact assessment, maybe look at some of the options that are available to groups and consider how they might want to make those elections and so on. So I think we're already now, especially in light of the additional administrative guidance that has been issued by the OECD, we are in a position to have a better image of how the rules will actually impact different groups. Probably going forward, it will be good for tax departments to consider how they want to communicate the impact of the Pillar 2 internally. So maybe to their boards, they will probably need extra funding for compliance with Pillar 2. So that's sometimes a difficult conversation, but probably one best had well in advance. So I think these are some of the issues that are relevant at this stage.
You know, it's interesting, Raluca, I guess, because we're in February, so December feels a long way away, or January next year.
Yeah.
But it really isn't, because these systems type issues take a long time to resolve themselves, to get budget, to figure out how to implement, to fit into systems. And then tax departments are going to get very busy very soon, I imagine, in Europe, because at year end, they'll probably need to decide what qualitative assessment, if any, they put in their IFRS statements regarding this. And then for next year, what guidance should they be giving everyone regarding their effective tax rate? So there's a lot of stuff coming down the pike in very short order, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly. And if we think about the safe harbor, the transitional safe harbors in particular, that's an assessment that groups will want to make now if they want to make use of those transitional safe harbors. And as you know, a lot of that relies on C by C data, which groups will have available because of their non-public C by C reporting requirements, but they might want to look at cleaning up that data if they will use it for the purposes of safe harbor. So there's already now a lot of work to be done in terms of data collection. And the way I think about this issue is also in the broader context of public country by country reporting as well, because you will need to think about what your C by C data will look like when you disclose it publicly. And if you're going to go through this process of making sure that the data is accurate for Pillar 2 purposes, then keep in mind at the same time that you will need the same data to meet your public C by C disclosure requirements in Europe very soon as well. So I see the two as being connected, although not immediately so, but because the source of the data is similar. I think that's an important point to keep in mind as well.
Well, and that's really an excellent point, the thought of repurposing efforts to meet a number of obligations coming forth. So if I can just press you on your crystal ball gazing a bit more, what else should people be considering?
I think an important point to consider is that member states have different internal procedures for adoption of new legislation. And I'm going to refer to Marco here because I know that Germany, where Marco sits, is an interesting example from this perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think in terms of timeline, we just heard that member states have until the end of this year to implement the rules. And we need to see whether member states will actually achieve this because of different internal procedures. Some member states can only do so as part of the budget law. Many are required to pass the draft legislation to Parliament, which then needs to approve this, which takes time. And what we have also seen quite a lot is that elections may delay the process. Just now we have seen that, for example, the DAX 7 reporting requirements, there have been some delays in certain member states where public elections are currently taking place. So this is definitely something to keep an eye on. And also, getting back to the administrative guidance and the global implementation framework, I think this will also have a huge impact because we already heard that this is an ongoing process and member states may be required to incorporate certain rules, certain elements of the global implementation framework into their local legislation because of constitutional limitations. For example, Germany cannot just have a dynamic link to the OECD materials, but needs to either incorporate the rules into national law or provide separate guidance on this. So I think member states will need to determine how to deal with the global implementation framework with additional guidance. And yeah, we will see whether they will be able to achieve this on time.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, it will be really interesting to monitor how things develop throughout the course of 2023. Our understanding is that the European Commission has asked member states to put forward draft legislation by fall 2023 at the latest to make sure that implementing laws are approved by the end of 2023. So that is sort of the limit that the European Commission has drawn. But as Marco said, with respect to Germany, and I think other member states are in this position as well, they might actually have to incorporate large chunks of the commentary or the administrative guidance into local legislation, and that's not really that easy to do. Some member states might be able to just adopt like a very simplified version of the rules simply based on the text of the directive with this dynamic link that refers back to the work that is being done at the level of the OECD, but not all of them will be able to do that. They will also have to decide whether they want to incorporate the safe harbors in domestic legislation or simply refer to the OECD documents. So a lot of decisions, and we think a lot of different approaches will come up as countries publish their implementing laws. And it's also interesting to see how adoption of Pillar 2 will interact with other initiatives that are happening in the EU now. So the Unshell Directive, which is aimed at identifying entities that are misused for tax purposes and that lack economic substance, and introducing rules that prevent these types of entities from obtaining tax benefits in the EU. Also the BEPS initiative, which is the new common corporate consolidated tax base, and that will have a very direct and clear relationship with the Pillar 2 rules as well. So all these other things that are happening in Europe will have to sort of be adapted to make sure that the impact of Pillar 2 is taken into consideration as well. And the other major area that we expect to see a lot of movement on is tax incentives, because I think there are currently in different member states some regimes that were meant to encourage certain types of activities, let's say R&D regimes that will have a negative impact on the effective tax rate from a Pillar 2 perspective. So European jurisdictions might want to look at maybe redesigning those regimes to make sure that a negative impact on the effective tax rate under the minimum tax directive will not have negative consequences for whatever other policy intentions they were trying to satisfy with these other regimes. And we're seeing that in the recent communication from the European Commission regarding their intention to soften state aid rules in Europe to allow member states to incentivize the production of green energy. In response to similar measures being introduced elsewhere in the world. So all these things are connected to each other, and we hope that legislators will keep in mind how these additional tax benefits will impact taxpayers under Pillar 2, just so that the intended benefits are actually achieved in practice and not cancelled out by top-up taxes due under the minimum tax directive.
Well, you both paint a very interesting picture, which is we think about December being far off, but Marco, to your point about national governments needing particular timeframes to get legislation implemented, the reality is that companies may not necessarily be able to have the luxury of waiting for local country draft legislation to come out, because it may come out right towards the end of the year. And this point, Raluca, you're making on green sector incentives, I guess we'll just have to watch and see how that one plays out. But certainly plenty to keep people busy through the rest of the year if they didn't have anything else to do. Well, fascinating as ever, Raluca and Marco, so thank you very much for your time. And I do look forward to catching up with you again just to see how things are playing out as national legislatures actually move to implement laws within their jurisdictions. So thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, Rodney. We'll keep in touch.
Thank you, Rodney.